The late afternoon sun draped the quiet neighborhood of Brookhaven in soft golden hues, casting long shadows across the sidewalks and illuminating the azaleas that bloomed proudly beneath white picket fences. It was the kind of day that seemed preserved in memory, still, warm, familiar. Children's bicycles leaned lazily against porch railings, and the occasional flutter of a wind chime broke the silence like a forgotten lullaby. Life moved slowly here, predictably, as it had for decades. The sort of place where everyone knew the mailman by name and front porches were more than architectural features, they were meeting places, quiet confessionals, daily stages of ordinary living. But on this particular afternoon, something happened that broke that peaceful rhythm like a dropped dish in a hushed kitchen. Without warning, a large German shepherd stumbled out from nowhere and collapsed on the porch of one of the modest brick homes nestled at the end of Rose Hill Drive. There was no warning cry, no growl or bark, just a heavy thud as the dog's body hit the wooden steps with a dull weight. Its sides heaved with labored breath, tongue hanging limp, eyes barely open yet flickering with a desperate kind of awareness. It was as if the creature had traveled miles on sheer will, arriving at this precise doorstep not by accident, but by some unknown pull. No collar adorned its thick neck, no tag clinked to identify it. Dust clung to its coat, and blood speckled its raw, cracked paw pads. Its strength was nearly gone, but still, it lifted one trembling leg and scratched faintly at the front door. That fragile, ghost-like sound might have gone unnoticed in another place, another time. But here, in a town where small things still mattered, that single gesture would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Neighbors, though typically observant, weren't around. Lawn sprinklers turned rhythmically across empty yards, and the occasional bark from another dog echoed. Distantly, uninterested. Yet somehow, in that quiet slice of suburbia, this dog, this uninvited, unknown creature, had chosen one door, one house, one family. Why this house? Why this dog? These were the kinds of questions that only made sense later, when hindsight paints meaning into mystery. At that moment, all anyone could have seen, if they had been looking, was a dying animal collapsed on a stranger's doorstep. But for the family inside, especially for the boy sitting quietly in his room just beyond the door, that afternoon was about to change everything. And what began as an ordinary day would soon become a story retold over cups of coffee, passed between generations, remembered not for how it started, but for what it revealed. Because sometimes, fate doesn't knock. Sometimes, it scratches gently at your door. Inside the modest red brick house at the end of Rose Hill Drive, the air was still, filled with the quiet hum of a ceiling fan and the distant ticking of a wall clock that had belonged to Eli's grandfather. The home smelled faintly of lemon furniture polish and old books, a comforting scent that clung to the curtains and whispered of long afternoons and quiet routines. 10-year-old Eli Hayes sat at his desk by the window, his wheelchair pulled close, a worn hardcover book resting across his knees. His thin fingers traced the edges of the pages, though his eyes had drifted from the words. Outside, the last rays of sun were stretching across the front lawn like fingers reaching for something just out of view. Eli had always loved this time of day. It was when the world softened, when the neighborhood fell into a hush, and the light seemed to slow down just for him. He needed those quiet moments. They were a kind of sanctuary. Born with a form of muscular dystrophy, Eli had never known the freedom of running through sprinklers or climbing backyard trees like the other boys on the block. He used a custom wheelchair most of the time, though his mother encouraged him to stand using braces when he could manage it, which was not often and never for long. Still, Eli never complained. There was a quiet dignity in how he carried himself, an old soul calmness that people noticed even if they couldn't quite explain why. He filled his time with stories, books about rescue dogs, wild wolves, and courageous animals that crossed impossible distances to find their way home. His small room was filled with pictures of golden retrievers and German shepherds taped above his desk. Once, when he was 6, he told his mother that animals weren't just animals, they were messengers. They showed up when people needed them most. His mother had smiled and said that was a lovely thought, but in her eyes there had been something else. A kind of knowing. As Eli turned the page in his book, he paused. A sound, so faint it could have been imagined, touched his ears. A gentle scraping. A scratch. He furrowed his brow and turned his head slightly toward the front of the house. There it was again. Faint. Uneven. Almost pleading. "Mom," he called, his voice barely above the murmur of the ceiling fan. From the kitchen, his mother, Janet Hayes, glanced up from the chopping board. "Did you hear that?" Eli asked. She stopped, listening. Another scrape. Not wind. Not a branch. Something else. Eli's pulse quickened. Not out of fear, but something stranger. A kind of recognition. As if the stories he'd read had quietly stepped off the page and were now whispering through the walls of his home. He didn't know it yet, but on the other side of that door, a soul not so different from his own was waiting. Desperate. Exhausted. And somehow, meant to find him. Janet hesitated only a moment before setting down her kitchen knife and wiping her hands on a towel. The scratching was too deliberate, too persistent to ignore. Eli was already maneuvering his wheelchair into the hallway, his eyes wide with curiosity in something deeper, hope, maybe. The hallway creaked beneath Janet's steps as she approached the door, casting a glance back to make sure Eli had stopped at a safe distance. She turned the knob slowly, the old brass handle cool under her fingers, and pulled the door open just enough to peek outside. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Slumped across the porch, sprawled against the welcome mat, lay a large German shepherd. Its chest heaved with effort, each breath sounding more like a gasp. Its fur was dark with streaks of sable and tan, matted in places and dusted with dried leaves. The dog's eyes flicked up at her, and Janet saw something that pulled at her deepest instincts, not fear, not aggression, but a raw and aching plea for help. "Oh, dear God," she whispered, and opened the door wider. Eli's voice rang out from behind her, alarmed but steady. "Mom, is it a dog?" She turned to him, her face pale. "Yes, honey. And he's in really bad shape." Eli rolled closer, stopping just at the edge of the threshold. He stared at the dog for a long moment, his lips parted in silence. The animal didn't move, didn't growl. Instead, it shifted slightly, as if recognizing something familiar in the boy's presence. "We have to help him," Eli said quietly, almost reverently. "He came here for a reason." Janet looked down at the dog again. There was blood on one paw, the pad split and crusted, and his breathing sounded shallow. "I'll get some water and a towel," she said, and disappeared into the kitchen. Left alone with the dog, Eli wheeled himself forward another foot. The edge of the sunlight touched the wheels of his chair, and the porch steps cast a long shadow between them. He reached out carefully. Slowly, until his hand was close enough to touch. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "You're okay now. You're safe." The dog twitched slightly at the sound of his voice, one ear flopping sideways, but he didn't pull away. His gaze met Eli's with a quiet trust that surprised even the boy. A moment later, Janet returned with a bowl of water and a damp cloth. She knelt beside the dog, gently placing the wet towel against his neck and offering the bowl near his muzzle. The dog lapped weakly at the water, barely able to swallow, but the effort was there. "We need to call someone," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "He's too far gone to wait much longer." Eli didn't respond. He was still watching the dog, watching him like someone who'd finally found something they didn't know they were missing. Something lost, now found, lying broken and waiting just beyond their front door. Dr. Lorna Fields arrived just before dusk, her old Navy pickup rattling slightly as it pulled into the driveway. She was a familiar figure in Brookhaven, gray-haired, practical, and always calm in a crisis. A mobile veterinarian for nearly 30 years, she'd seen her share of emergencies, but something about Janet's voice on the phone had stirred a different kind of urgency. She approached the porch with her bag in hand and knelt immediately beside the dog. Eli watched from the doorway, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair, his face lined with quiet concern. Rusty, that was the name he had chosen for the German Shepherd in the hour since they'd first brought him inside. It just felt right, he'd said. Like the name had already been his, waiting to be remembered. Dr. Fields moved gently, checking the dog's breathing, pulse, paws. Her fingers worked with practiced grace, but her brow furrowed more with each moment. "He's severely dehydrated," she said softly. "His paws are raw, looks like he's been walking for miles on hot pavement. No ID, no microchip. He's likely been out there for a long time." Eli's mother stood nearby, arms crossed, worry etched deep into her face. "Will he make it?" she asked. The vet didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and began preparing fluids. "We'll do our best," she said at last. "But tonight is going to be critical. If he makes it through the next 24 hours, he's got a fighting chance." Eli said nothing. He was watching Rusty's eyes. They were half-closed, dull, distant. And yet, every few seconds, they would flicker in his direction, like a match trying to catch. Dr. Fields inserted a small foreline and carefully began the process of hydration. She worked with steady hands, murmuring gentle reassurances, but the room itself felt hushed, as if the walls knew something sacred was taking place. "He's not ready to go," Eli said softly. Janet turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Eli looked at her. His voice steady. "He came here for help. He chose this house. That means something." Dr. Fields glanced up, studying the boy. In all her years tending to animals, she had learned to listen to instincts, especially in children. There was a calm certainty in Eli's tone that made her nod, almost involuntarily. "It might," she said. "Sometimes they know where to go." The room fell into silence again, broken only by the soft hum of the four and the occasional shallow breath from Rusty. As the light outside faded, Janet turned on a small lamp and placed it near the dog's head, casting a warm circle of light around him. Eli moved closer, reached down, and let his fingers brush gently against Rusty's ear. "You're not alone," he whispered. He would say those words again, many times, over the hours to come. And each time, they felt less like a promise and more like a vow. By morning, the story had already begun to ripple through the neighborhood. In a place where news usually centered on lost lawn tools or someone's porch being painted the wrong shade of beige, word of the mysterious, injured German Shepherd spread like warm air through a screen door. A few curious neighbors passed by the Hayes house on their morning walks, pretending not to linger, though their eyes darted toward the front steps where the dog had collapsed the day before. Janet, weary from a sleepless night watching over Rusty, had placed a sign on the door, "Sick dog recovering. Thank you for understanding." Some left quietly folded blankets on the porch rail. Others dropped off canned food, sealed with notes that read, "For the shepherd" or "Hope he pulls through." Eli watched it all from the living room window, his heart swelling with a cautious sort of joy. He had never seen the neighborhood come together for something like this. And though Rusty still lay weak and unmoving beside the couch, a gentle breath rising and falling beneath a soft towel, Eli felt like something was beginning to change, not just inside their home, but outside of it, too. But not everyone shared the feeling. That afternoon, while Janet was trimming the front hedge, Mr. Whitaker from 2 houses down came striding up the walk. Tall, stiff, and always in pressed khakis, he was the sort of man who still read the newspaper with a ruler and called the city if someone's recycling bin was out too early. "Janet," he said, not unkindly but firm, "I heard about the dog. And I sympathize, truly. But I think we need to be careful. We don't know where he came from, what he might be carrying. These dogs can turn aggressive. Especially when they're injured. Janet blinked, straightening. He hasn't shown any aggression. My son's been with him the whole time. I understand, he said, voice low. But some of the neighbors are worried. I thought it would be better to say something now, before it becomes a situation. His words weren't cruel, but they hung in the air like a cold wind. Eli overheard it all from inside. He didn't say anything, but his hands tightened around the armrests of his chair. Later that day, as more neighbors stopped by to offer support, homemade treats, a soft dog bed, a few dollar bills tucked into envelopes, Eli couldn't help noticing the hesitation in their eyes. They were moved, yes. Concerned, certainly. But beneath it all, there was fear. Of the unknown. Of the unexpected. Of something they couldn't quite understand. And yet, amidst that fear, kindness kept showing up. Quiet, humble, hesitant, but real. That night, as Eli stroked Rusty's head beneath the lamplight, he whispered, "They're scared, but they're still trying. That's something, right?" Rusty didn't move, but his tail gave the faintest twitch. In that small gesture, Eli found his answer. That evening, after the house had settled into its quiet rhythms and the last light had faded from the corners of the sky, Eli sat at the kitchen table, his notebook open in front of him. Rusty lay nearby, curled on a folded quilt, his breathing steady but faint. The glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the room, and for a moment, everything felt still. Eli looked down at the page, his pencil hovering above it. Then he began to write. It wasn't a school essay or a story about a brave dog saving a town. It was a letter, plain and simple. A letter from a boy who didn't have much strength in his legs, but a whole lot of it in his heart. "Dear neighbors," he began, "I know some of you are scared about the dog we're taking care of. His name is Rusty. He showed up on our porch yesterday, and he was barely alive. I don't know why he came here, but I think he needed someone. Maybe he needed me. I've spent most of my life in a wheelchair, and I've always believed that animals can sense things we don't always see in each other." Rusty didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just looked at us like he was asking for help. And we couldn't say no. "I know he looks big, and I know he's hurt. But he's not dangerous. He's scared, like anyone would be. He's gentle. And kind. And I think he's trying to get better, just like a lot of us are. I'm not asking you to love him right away. I'm just asking you not to be afraid. Thank you for the food and the towels and the kind words. They mean more than you know. Sincerely, Eli Hayes." Janet found the letter later that night, neatly folded on the table, and read it in silence. Her eyes welled with tears, and without saying a word, she took a photo of it with her phone. The next morning, she posted it to the neighborhood forum online with a short message, "Our son wanted to say something about the dog. We didn't expect this. But maybe it's what we all needed to hear." Within hours, the post had gathered more attention than anything their little online group had ever seen. Dozens of comments poured in. People who had been silent the day before now wrote words of support. One neighbor offered to build a small ramp to help Eli visit the vet clinic more easily. Another, who had previously been unsure, asked if they could donate toys or blankets. And surprisingly, even Mr. Whitaker responded, "Tell Eli that his letter reminded me of the dog I had when I was a boy. I'm still not sure about this one, but I'll try to keep an open mind." The change wasn't loud or sudden. It was soft. Gentle. Like healing. Like trust growing one small act at a time. Eli never set out to change minds. He only spoke from the heart. But sometimes, that's all it takes. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, one that revolved entirely around Rusty's recovery. Each afternoon, after his homeschooling lessons and physical therapy exercises, Eli would ask to visit the clinic where Dr. Fields was keeping Rusty under observation. Janet never said no. She could see how much these visits meant to him, how they lit up something inside her son that had long flickered under the weight of limitation. The clinic was small, tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store, its interior filled with the familiar scent of antiseptic and warm hay. Rusty rested in a quiet room at the back, his 4 lines still connected, but his eyes brighter each time Eli arrived. Eli always wheeled himself straight to the corner where Rusty lay, talking softly to him about his day, the books he'd read, the bird he saw from the kitchen window, the dream he had where they both ran through a field of sunflowers. Sometimes Rusty would only blink slowly, his head resting on his paws. But he always watched Eli, and there was something in that gaze, steady, silent, that made the boy feel less alone. Then one afternoon, something changed. It was cloudy outside, the kind of dull gray that seemed to hush the world. Eli rolled into the room and began speaking to Rusty in his usual soft voice, when the dog stirred. Not just the flick of an ear or a shift of the paw, but a push, an actual attempt to rise. Eli froze. "Mom," he whispered. Janet and Dr. Fields, who had just stepped into the hallway, turned quickly. Rusty groaned slightly as he braced his front legs, his muscles trembling under the effort. Slowly, shakily, he pushed himself upright. His back legs wobbled. His tail swept low across the floor in a cautious arc. And then, with a soft whine, he took a single step forward. Eli's mouth parted in awe, his eyes shining. Rusty took another step, then another, until he was close enough to press his head gently into Eli's lap. The room went still. Dr. Fields, watching from the door, shook her head slowly in disbelief. "That's his first time standing on his own since he came in," she said. "I didn't expect it to happen this soon." Janet knelt beside her son, resting a hand on his shoulder. Eli didn't speak. He simply ran his fingers through Rusty's fur and smiled with a kind of peace that can't be taught, only felt. "You're doing so great, Rusty," he whispered, leaning forward. "I knew you could." In that small, sterile room, surrounded by shelves of gauze and bandages, something sacred had occurred. It wasn't just a dog standing. It was a soul returning. And in that moment, the bond between boy and dog deepened into something unspoken, unbreakable, something that neither illness nor distance could ever undo. It was a Friday afternoon when the ordinary gave way to the unforgettable. The skies had cleared after days of gray, and a warm breeze drifted through the quiet streets of Brookhaven. Janet had errands to run, and Rick was still at work, so Eli, freshly returned from his physical therapy session, made his way up the sidewalk alone for the first time in weeks. His chair rolled smoothly over the familiar cracks in the pavement, his backpack lightly bumping against the handles. He felt tired, but peaceful. The world, for once, seemed to match his pace. Just 2 blocks from home, he turned the corner and noticed a small gathering ahead, 4 teenagers standing near someone's yard. As he rolled closer, Eli's eyes narrowed. In the middle of the group, a small, scruffy dog cowered beside a trash can, tail tucked, ears flat. One of the boys nudged it with his foot, laughing. Another tossed a stick toward its head. "Come on, Mutt, fetch it," he jeered. Eli's breath caught. He felt the familiar twist of helplessness, the kind that had shadowed him since he was old enough to know what he couldn't do. But then something surged in him, sharper than fear. He gripped the wheels of his chair and called out. "Stop it!" His voice cracked in the air, startled even himself. The boys turned. One smirked. "Look who's talking," another sneered. "Mind your business, Wheels." Eli's heart pounded, but he didn't back away. "Leave him alone," he said again, firmer now, though his hands trembled on the armrests. Then, before anyone could move, a blur of motion tore through the side yard. A figure, lean, strong, fast, charged across the grass with startling speed. Rusty. He had slipped from the hold of Dr. Field's assistant, who had been walking him nearby for light rehabilitation. But now, he wasn't walking, he was sprinting. His paws barely touched the earth, his focus laser-sharp as he barreled toward the scene. The boys scattered before he even reached them, retreating with shouts of surprise. Rusty came to a stop between Eli and the shaken dog, his stance wide, protective. He didn't growl, didn't bark, he didn't have to. His presence said everything. Chest heaving, head high, Rusty stood like a soldier returned to duty. The smaller dog bolted into the bushes. Eli stared in amazement, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. Rusty turned then, and with a soft whimper, walked back to Eli's side and sat, pressing gently against the boy's leg. A neighbor across the street had witnessed the entire thing, phone in hand. Within hours, the video would make its way onto the local forum, drawing tears and praise and more than a few apologies from those who had doubted Rusty's nature. But in that moment, none of that mattered to Eli. He reached out, placed a trembling hand on Rusty's head, and whispered, "Thank you." The day had started like any other. But after that, nothing would ever be quite the same. By Saturday morning, the video had already been viewed thousands of times. It had started small, shared by the neighbor who captured it, posted with a caption that read, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear fur." But the story had a quiet power that needed no embellishment. A boy in a wheelchair, standing up, figuratively, if not physically, for a helpless animal. A dog, once nearly dead, charging to his side in a moment of danger. It was real. Raw. The kind of thing people didn't just watch, they felt. And they shared it, again and again. Phones began ringing. A local radio station called to ask for an interview. The neighborhood forum lit up with comments, some from familiar names, others from total strangers. Messages poured in, "I cried watching this. This restored my faith in people. That dog knew exactly what he was doing." The Hayes family hadn't planned on any of it. Eli had never wanted attention. But now, suddenly, their front yard was a place of quiet pilgrimage. People left cards, drawings, little dog treats in gift bags. Someone tied a blue ribbon around the mailbox with a note that simply said, "For Rusty, the bravest heart on Rose Hill Drive." Janet stood by the window, watching the small stream of visitors and deliveries with quiet amazement. It wasn't fame they were feeling, it was something more tender. Recognition. Not just of Rusty, but of the bond that had formed between him and Eli. It was as though people could see in their story a reflection of something they missed in their own lives, a reminder that loyalty, courage, and love still had a place in the world. Even Mr. Whitaker came by. He didn't say much. Just walked up the steps, placed a brand new orthopedic dog bed on the porch, and cleared his throat awkwardly. "I misjudged him," he said. "And maybe, the boy too." Janet smiled and thanked him, though her voice caught as she did. Whitaker patted Rusty's head, then nodded once at Eli and left without another word. Inside, Eli sat on the floor beside Rusty, combing gently through the dog's thick fur. His phone buzzed again, another message, another news site asking for a photo, a quote, something to add to their growing article. But Eli ignored it. He wasn't interested in clicks or cameras. All he cared about was the way Rusty had looked at him in that moment, the unwavering focus, the complete trust. That was the real story. Not what happened on the street, but what had been built in quiet moments long before. He leaned down and whispered into Rusty's ear, "They're finally seeing what I saw the first time I looked at you." Rusty's tail thumped softly in reply. Outside, the world kept spinning, but for Eli and Rusty, everything had shifted. Not because they had gone viral, but because, for once, the world had slowed down enough to truly see them. And for a boy who had often felt invisible, that meant more than words could say. It was a crisp Sunday morning when the Hayes family stepped out onto their front porch, the early autumn air laced with the scent of turning leaves and chimney smoke. The neighborhood had gathered quietly along the sidewalks, bundled in light jackets and scarves, their faces a mix of warmth and anticipation. What had started as a simple idea, just a short walk down the block, had somehow become something more. A quiet ceremony. A shared moment. A small but powerful declaration of what could happen when compassion triumphed over doubt. Eli sat in his wheelchair at the top of the porch steps, his braces already fastened around his thin legs. Rusty stood beside him, steady and calm, his golden brown coat brushed clean, his posture proud but relaxed. Janet knelt beside her son, checking the straps one last time. "Are you sure you're ready?" she asked. Eli nodded. "I've been ready since the day he stood up for me." The plan was simple. Eli would walk from his front door to the end of the block, with Rusty by his side. It wasn't far, just a stretch of pavement between two familiar mailboxes. But for Eli, it might as well have been a marathon. For months, walking had been more idea than action. Painful. Exhausting. Often discouraging. But not today. Today was different. Today he wasn't walking alone. The crowd grew quiet as Eli took a deep breath and placed his hand gently on Rusty's back. Rusty didn't move, just stood there, solid and still, like a pillar carved from loyalty itself. Eli leaned forward, shifted his weight, and rose slowly from the chair. A collective breath swept through the onlookers as he found his balance. One foot forward. Then the other. His hand never left Rusty's shoulder. They moved slowly, each step deliberate. At first, you could hear the soft tap of the braces on the pavement, the jingle of Rusty's collar. But as they reached the halfway point, something extraordinary happened. Applause. Soft, respectful, but full of emotion. It began with a few hands, then grew into a gentle wave of clapping, like rain on a quiet rooftop. Some neighbors had tears in their eyes. Others simply smiled, hands pressed to their hearts. Mr. Whitaker wiped at his glasses with a handkerchief, pretending it was the breeze. At the end of the block, Eli stopped and turned to Rusty, his voice barely above a whisper. "We did it," he said. Rusty looked up, his tail wagging in slow, steady rhythm. It wasn't just about the distance. It was about the meaning carried in every step. The boy who had once only watched the world go by was now walking back into it, with a companion who had once been just as broken. And in that quiet moment, beneath the golden trees and the watchful gaze of friends and strangers alike, a neighborhood remembered what it meant to believe again. In healing. In courage. In each other. In the weeks that followed the walk, something subtle but undeniable began to change in the neighborhood. It wasn't loud or sudden, no grand announcements or block parties, but rather a quiet shift in how people looked at one another, how they slowed their steps when passing by, how they paused just a little longer to speak, to listen. It was as if Eli and Rusty had cracked something open, revealing a softer undercurrent beneath the routines of suburban life. Where once there had been polite distance, there was now a thread of connection, and at the center of it all was a boy and his dog. People who hadn't spoken in years found themselves talking again, first about the video, then about the walk, and eventually about things that had nothing to do with Rusty at all. Children began drawing chalk paw prints on the sidewalk in front of the Hayes home. Someone placed a small wooden sign in their front yard that read, "Home of a Hero." It was Rusty's image carved into it, but everyone knew it was also about Eli. Neighbors began volunteering small acts of kindness without being asked, raking leaves for one another, bringing over homemade bread, offering rides when someone's car broke down. And each time someone knocked on the Hayes door, they were greeted not just by Janet or Rick, but often by Rusty himself, tail wagging, eyes warm with a kind of understanding that seemed beyond his species. He had become, in an unspoken way, the heart of the street. The transformation didn't stop there. The local elementary school started a fundraiser for animal rescue shelters, naming it Rusty's Rescue Run. Children wore matching shirts with Rusty's paw print on them. Eli was invited as an honorary guest, and though crowds still made him nervous, he agreed, so long as Rusty could come with him. Mr. Whitaker, once the most skeptical voice on the block, donated the printing costs for the shirts and offered to organize next year's event. When asked why, he only shrugged and said, "I suppose we all need to be reminded, now and then, what love looks like when it shows up uninvited." It became clear that Rusty hadn't just been rescued, he had become a rescuer in his own right. Not only for Eli, whose courage was growing daily, but for everyone who had forgotten how good it felt to care without reason, to give without expecting. Sometimes healing doesn't come in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on 4 tired legs, collapsing at a door you didn't know was waiting to be opened. That was the gift Rusty brought to Rose Hill Drive. Not just a story, not just a memory, but a new way forward. One where compassion mattered more than fear. Where small acts of bravery could reshape a community. And where one boy's steady belief in a broken dog reminded everyone that even in the most uncertain places, hope still knocks. Years from now, the story of Rusty and Eli would still be told on Rose Hill Drive, not as a tale of tragedy or spectacle, but as something gentler, deeper. It would come up in conversations over back fences, whispered to grandchildren sitting on porch swings, or remembered in quiet moments when the world felt heavy. People would recall how one autumn afternoon, a weary dog chose a doorstep, and how that choice, simple as it seemed, rewrote the rhythm of an entire neighborhood. Eli, now taller, stronger in his own quiet way, still carried the same soft-spoken wisdom that had once poured from the letter he wrote as a boy. Rusty never left his side. As the seasons changed and the colors of childhood softened into the steady tones of growing up, their bond remained, steadfast, wordless, and beautifully ordinary. Because what had formed between them wasn't built on dramatic rescues or viral videos, but on the day-to-day threads of trust and loyalty. Walks. Silences. Shared glances that needed no translation. It turned out that love, in its truest form, rarely shouts. It doesn't ask for attention. It simply shows up, especially when it's least expected. Sometimes, it arrives in the form of a child who refuses to let fear speak louder than kindness. Sometimes, it limps up the steps on worn-out paws, asking only for a place to rest. And sometimes, when the timing is right and the heart is open, the broken pieces in one soul fit perfectly into the cracks of another. Rusty was never claimed by a former owner. No posters, no microchips, no missing dog notices ever appeared. It was as if he had always been meant to find his way to Eli, not lost, just waiting to be found. And in being found, he helped others find something too, their gentler selves, their better angels, their willingness to believe again in second chances. What remains isn't just the memory of a boy and his dog, but the quiet lesson they left behind. That strength isn't always loud. That healing often begins in silence. And that the greatest acts of grace sometimes start with nothing more than a simple scratch at the door.